in the Mormon world and maybe in the Christian world, as a kid, your first memories of church are going to be going to church, sitting in, sacrament meeting, as they call it in Mormonism, going to primary, learning the songs. So sort of a regular church attendance every week, and getting together with other families or other children, and the kind of children or youth programs that emerge throughout childhood and adolescence of religious instruction, of song, of community building. Does any of that play into the life of a child growing up in Scientology, or to your life? What was the weekly, we'll just call it religious observance, like?
Well, in Scientology, there are Sunday services, but that came way later. Scientology doesn't have weekly rituals as such. What they have is they have classes that they offer, and they have counseling. And those are the services that Scientology provides. In many, many ways, Scientology is a lot more like a business than it is a religion. It sells classes, it sells counseling by the hour, and you pay set donation rates for those services or for those classes. And of course, they're selling books and lectures of L. Ron Hubbard's. So those are supposed to be its main income streams. And Sunday services, prayers, things like that, none of that's really a thing in Scientology. There's no God figure in Scientology. I wasn't raised to believe in God. God was a non-entity for me growing up. It was somebody that I was familiar with the concept of God because other children were being raised with God belief. And I sort of, I didn't really know what to think about it. I was sort of like, well, what do my parents think about it? And they seemed kind of ambivalent about it. Didn't seem really clear cut one way or the other. And Scientology doesn't really get into God very much. So none of that was part of the upbringing, right? Scientology prides itself on being a practical, applied religious philosophy. So it's all about assists and the tone scale and auditing and these things that you do in your life is what Scientology is more kind of how it operates. And so but there is definitely a social life in Scientology. And I was going to mention that my parents very much started hanging around with other Scientologists, having them over. All of our friends growing up were Scientologists. Not my friends. I met friends at school and stuff who obviously were not Scientologists, but because I didn't go to private school, I went to public school. My parents couldn't afford private school because they were paying for Scientology with all their money. So all of our money was pretty much going to Scientology. And we did buy a house. We bought a very, very cheap fixer-upper in Pasadena as our first house, and we moved into that when I hit fourth grade. And so I started going to Linda Vista in Pasadena. We kind of lived just by the Rose Bowl in Pasadena. Mm-hmm. And that was where our first house was. And my dad started fixing that up. And they were actually starting to work for Scientology now at the Pasadena Mission. It was not an official, full-blown Scientology organization, what we call an org. They don't call them churches. They call them orgs. I mean, that kind of gives you an idea of the flavor of how people think about Scientology in the world of Scientology. Nobody thinks of Scientology as a church. They call it a church, but they don't think about it that way. They think about it as a place that you go to do classes and get counseling. So my parents were working at the Pasadena Mission, and for years they did that, and they made friends with all the other staff, and we had parties and things, and all those people would come over, or we'd go over to their houses or whatever. Our best friends, my parents' best friends, were Scientologists, and so I grew up around all these people. So it was interesting how my parents ceased having non-Scientology friends. I watched that happen. We were just surrounded by other Scientologists. And the attitude and the things they would say, right? And this is another thing that spills over, and it's another aspect of things that happen in your formative years. I overheard conversations because I was there during these parties and stuff. They'd be sitting around drinking and laughing and listening to music, and the kids would run around. And I would hear them have conversations about the wogs. Okay, now wog is a very derogatory racial term in Britain. I didn't know this, right? This was a term Hubbard used to describe non-Scientologists. You know, in the same way that in the Harry Potter world, you know, if you're either in the wizarding world or you're a muggle. Muggles are people who don't have the magic, right?
Right.
Well, in Scientology, if you're a wog, you don't have the magic. You know, you literally don't, you know, you're not a Scientologist. You haven't learned the truth yet. So you're a wog. And again, I know that this is a derogatory term, and I'm kind of stressing it because I know that now. At the time, you know, that we were using it, I didn't even know it had a racial component to it. But I would listen to the parents and my parents and their friends talking about the wogs and how stupid and idiotic and dumb the wogs are, and how none of the wogs get it, and the wogs are destroying the world, and the this and the that. So the us versus them. They didn't have to even talk to me directly to set that up. I just had to overhear them talking about it because my dad would go on a roll, man. And if there was somebody who influenced my opinions growing up, it was my dad. You know, when he got on tear about something, I was like all ears because I wanted to know how the world worked. And I thought my dad and my mom were the purveyors of truth, right? So I learned growing up that all the non-Scientologists were the ones who were destroying the world. And it was the Scientologists who were trying to save it and stop all of that. And we were the good guys and they were the bad guys. So before I even became officially a Scientologist, I thought Scientologists were the ones who were saving the world and all the non-Scientologists were the ones actively trying to destroy it.
Yeah. And again, Mormons are going to really pick up on the parallels here. This idea that you are the chosen people, this sort of Mormon exceptionalism, that literally you're not just here to be good, you're here to save the world. In Mormon's case, we're here to usher in the coming of Jesus Christ. We're chosen by God in the last days. And but you only hang around Mormons, and so that's certainly going to limit your vulnerability to outside information. It's going to limit the thoughts you're able to have, and it's going to condition you to not ask certain questions or to not behave in certain ways, because the group ends up being a really strong reinforcer of the organization's values and of their boundaries and of their limits. And so you think you're better than everyone else. You only hang around people like you, and you look down on the people that aren't part of your in-group. And this isn't just Mormonism or Scientology. This is just classic human tribalism. And it happens in almost, if you're a Redskins fan, it's that way. It's whatever organization you're in. If you're a feminist, you're gonna feel that way about non-feminists. If you're a Trump supporter, an Obama supporter, you're gonna hate the other side. But it's very clear that religions all rely on this, it seems. And so what I hear you say, Chris, is that it's not go to church every Sunday, sing songs, hear a pastor talk in Scientology. It's more you go to the local org, and you receive the trainings or the therapy or the instruction, and then your social circles are still very much with other Scientologists. Exactly
right. One other comment that I'd like to make real fast about childhood indoctrination, though, that I think is relevant and important to this conversation is that children don't have critical thinking skills. It's not like our brains are attuned to be critical thinkers. And so adults have had a chance to examine their beliefs from an adult point of view and decide whether they should or shouldn't believe them for themselves. And I'll give an adult as wide a median as he needs or wants or latitude to believe whatever the hell they want if they can reason through why they should believe that. At least they have the ability to reason it through. Their reasons might be ludicrous, flat earthers come to mind, but at least they have some idea of why they have reasoned it through that they can explain to you. A child doesn't have that ability. When you tell a child he's an immortal spiritual being, he just takes it. And he doesn't have any reason to believe it except you told him. and he just accepts it as true. And this is the real problem with second gen, third gen cult members, but it's also a problem with how we indoctrinate our kids. As we give them these quote unquote truths that are not evidentiary based, as though they are, and we insist that they believe them. And in fact, in some households, children are beaten if they ask questions or express doubt. So, I think I think we really, really do need to look at how we are raising our children, because religious indoctrination is not helping them, At least I don't think so. And I think for the reasons I just explained, it's because if you're giving children information and they have no understanding of why that information is useful, important, or true, then they're not going to be able to think critically about it, and ever, and that's where fanaticism comes from eventually. So anyway, just wanted to comment on that.
No, that's great. Okay.
Okay. So let's move forward a little bit, because there's a lot to the story.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So I haven't talked this much about my childhood in a long time.
Well, thank you for doing that.
Yeah. So, okay. So high school, let's see. Okay. So I guess the next official stop here would be when I was 15 years old. So I was a D&D player. I was a voracious reader. I was kind of nerdy.
Wait, let me ask you just a couple quick questions.
Yeah.
Were there dietary restrictions? So
no.
Things you could and couldn't eat or drink. I'm going to ask you like a list of sort of behavioral things just in like 5 minutes.
Yep.
Were there things you couldn't eat or drink as a Scientologist?
No.
Okay. So alcohol's okay.
Alcohol's okay. Drugs are not.
Cigarettes are okay. Cigarettes are okay.
Cigarettes okay. Scientologists smoke like chimneys, especially in the 70s when I grew up. There was smoking and it was drinking. In fact, my dad actually had an alcohol problem, which I didn't learn about until later because they covered it up pretty well. But yeah, alcohol and cigarettes are okay.
Okay. Are there is there a dress code? Are there things you can and can't wear?
No. But if you were to be overly sleazy, let's say, walking into a Church of Scientology, especially now more so than in the 70s, somebody's going to talk to you about it. But there's no official dress code or guidelines or anything like that. They're not the quiverful Duggar, types as far as that goes.
And when you say sleazy, you mean like a woman with a low-cut dress or a
or a guy, with wearing goofy shorts, or Speedos or something. I mean, somebody's gonna have something to say about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about like control of sexual behavior, of like masturbation, of looking at pornography, of premarital sex? Were there guidelines around sexuality for children, youth, or adults?
In the 70s, no, not so much. In the 80s and beyond is when the clamps started coming down on that. And masturbation's a no-no. This is not written down anywhere. It's all sort of in the culture of Scientology at this point. And this came from Miscavige more so than Hubbard, that there's to be, masturbation's bad, it's called sexually restimulating yourself, And the idea is that you're pulling mental image pictures when you're fantasizing. You're pulling these pictures from your mind, and some of these pictures might be coming from your reactive mind. So you're kind of reactivating that, and you're reactivating past stresses and trauma as a result of doing that. And so it could be harmful to your mental health. So you shouldn't be fantasizing too much or too heavily. And so therefore you shouldn't be, jerking it too often, because that's always, connected with fantasizing. And so that's why it's potentially bad for you. And this was based on one sentence that Hubbard wrote in a book back in 1951. And taken, they take that one line. I mean, Hubbard literally said, masturbation is not that big of a deal. Lots of species do it. And that's what's written. But then Miscavige took it and said, oh no, look, it's very harmful to you. It's very restimulative. You should not be doing it. And has used that to bludgeon Scientologists and control their sex lives and their masturbatory lives since the 1980s.
Okay. Is adultery frowned on?
Very much so.
What
Very
about
much
just
so.
stealing and lying and the basic 10 Commandments?
Yep.
So
There's
how does
nothing about obviously taking the Lord's name in vain or any of that. There's no sanctity in Scientology, but there are rules about being moral. There are lots of morality rules in Scientology, but most of them are pretty common sense. Don't steal, don't lie, stuff like that. Don't hurt a person of good intent.
But do all those come from some writings of L. Ron Hubbard versus the
Yeah.
10 Commandments, or?
Yeah, there's a book called The Way to Happiness.
Okay, that
which
you mentioned that.
Yeah, we talked about that, I think. And that was where he codified a moral code. And that didn't exist in Scientology until 1980. So up until then, there was what was called the Code of Honor. And that came out in like 1952 or 53. And Hubbard said it was a self-disciplinary code. It couldn't be enforced on you, but most Scientology ethics officers will try to enforce it on Scientologists. And the Code of Honor has things like never disparage, an ally or something. And oh God, there's a whole bunch of stuff in there, but now all of it, of course, is escaping me right now. But you can look it up online. The Code of Honor is on the Scientology website.
But that was in some way replaced by the Way to Happiness or whatever.
Yeah, it's sort of, the Code of Honor was a pretty steep hill to climb for most people. It's got some pretty tough restrictions on it, which is one of the reasons why Hubbard said it was so. It's only it can only be enforced on a self-disciplinary way. But Scientology will enforce on you no adultery, don't be promiscuous. They're not really into promiscuity, stuff like that. Take care of yourself, take care of your body, stuff like that.
Okay. You've kind of already addressed this, but I want to really hit it explicitly. So whether or not there's a God, whether or not Jesus lived, whether or not Jesus died for our sins, a Bible, how does Scientology approach all those things?
Hubbard calls it all nonsense. Basically,
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. Hubbard regarded organized religion, and especially the Christians in the Catholic Church. He was really down on the Catholic Church all the time. He basically considered the organized religion was a control operation used to control populaces. And he thought that the priesthood, which he talked about in those terms, the priesthood, these kind of things, were people who were taking advantage of the masses for their own personal wealth and ego and that kind of thing. And he wasn't wrong. I mean, it's not like you can't find lots and lots of instances of this. But he just wrote the whole thing off. And he said that that they were sending their prayers up to a myth, that the Christian God was a bit of a myth. And that there was this very long religious tradition that was sort of spiritual in nature, and it was sort of a good thing. And he would talk appreciatively about Buddhism and about the long spiritual tradition of the Vedas and the Vedic hymns and the Indian Hindu traditions. But he was pretty down on Western religion, and he just thought that they were out to get people's money and out to get people's, and out to control people's lives. And again, he's not particularly wrong. I've developed my own ideas about organized religion since leaving Scientology that parallel some of those, but they're not based on Hubbard's nonsense. I've come to my own conclusions about stuff.
What about God? What about God?
Yeah, God is just something that Hubbard really doesn't address very often. What he said, there's one line that I've always remembered, which is that you will not actually be able to understand God or the infinite being that is the creator until you have gone through all of Scientology's levels to the point that you have a clear understanding of every other kind of life that exists in the universe. And I'm paraphrasing right now. There's another principle in Scientology called the dynamics. Sorry, I got to give you this exposition so this sentence will make sense. But Scientology divides all of life into 8 parts. Those parts are represented as concentric circles with you in the middle. you for yourself as an entity, which is called the first dynamic, is you. The second dynamic is sex as an act, and your family, your immediate family, right? They're all second dynamic. The family you create and the family you come from, that's all second dynamic. The third dynamic is groups. Any group you're part of is part of your third dynamic. You could call your work your third dynamic. You could call a club you go to your third dynamic. It's just part of groups that you're part of. So you see these concentric circles start moving out in volume and size and influence, right? So the fourth dynamic is mankind as a whole, all people, men and women, right? Everybody. That's the fourth dynamic. Fifth dynamic is animal life, plant life, any other kind of life except people, all over the universe. This is not just on Earth, right? All life, fifth dynamic. Sixth dynamic is the material universe, matter, energy, space, and time. The seventh dynamic is spirits, all spiritual entities, any spiritual existence, anything having to do with that is seventh dynamic. And finally, the eighth dynamic is God or infinity. So Hubbard said that you will not be able to understand the eighth dynamic until you have advanced through and understand all of these first seven dynamics. So that's the actual thing that he said and the context of it. So, you know, when you say something like that to a bunch of Scientologists, what they interpret that to mean is that they have to advance to the same level that Hubbard is at the top of the hierarchy of services and counseling that you do in Scientology. You have to get all the way to the top of that, and then you'll have some concept of what God's all about.
So it mirrors for us this continual striving for worthiness and this continual striving for advancement. It's almost like Boy Scouts on steroids. You got to get the Star Merit badge, and then the tenderfoot, then the star, then the life, then the eagle.
That's right.
And you got to do all these things to earn it. And by the way, it costs a crap ton of money and time. But
that's exactly how the bridge works.
You can achieve this super high level thing.
That's right.
Really quick, I have to ask this question about authority then. This is fascinating.
Yeah.
So Mormonism, well, like in Catholicism, it's like, well, Jesus ordained Peter, and then Peter had Christ's permission, and then he started the church because Jesus said, upon this rock will I blah, blah, blah. And then Protestants had the problem of like, how do we break off from Catholicism but still claim to have the authority? And I don't know how they figured that out, but that's why Joseph Smith basically said that when when all the churches fell into apostasy, God had to come down and ordain Joseph Smith himself, or through angelic spirits, as the anointed one, to lead the church in the modern day. So Joseph had to claim some sort of authority, divine authority, to be able to call himself God's prophet on the earth. What did L. Ron Hubbard use to convince his followers that he had any authority or was special in any way where he deserved, because he's coming up with all these theories. It's very clear that just like Joseph Smith, he's taken pop psychology, he's taken maybe Freudism, he's taken pop science or just his own crazy theories and just weaving a bunch of stuff together and coming up with all these levels and all these approaches and all this key to happiness, just like any of us could. How did he convince his followers that he had any authority or, sort of like divine blessing to be telling us what truth is? Like, what made anyone pay attention to this guy?
Yeah, no, he claimed it was all a research trail. He claimed he was doing scientific research. He didn't come at this from a prophet status. In other words, he didn't come at it as though he was, giving divine revelation. Hubbard's assertions were always that his discoveries were an outgrowth or a product of his research, and that he was researching and studying man as a spiritual entity, right? And that originally with Dianetics, as you'll recall, it was a science of the mind. So Hubbard wasn't making spiritual claims with Dianetics. He was making mental claims about the modern science of mental health. People had some gain from some of those practices. Again, a small percentage of people who tried it liked it. So they said, well, there must be something to this. Hubbard must be on to something. He must be a good researcher. And he claimed that he was an independent scientist, basically, a non-funded, self-funding sort of scientist. And when Dianetics came out, he continued doing research and lecturing frequently, weekly, and claiming that he was doing case studies and he was tracking the progress of people with different Dianetics techniques. And they were trying this and they were trying that. And when the second book came out, called Science of Survival in 1951, it was subtitled Faster, Simplified Dianetic Techniques. So it was continuing the idea that he was generating a science through research. Through those researches, Hubbard got people to take him seriously about the spiritual claims because he said that what was coming up in the research was past lives. He wasn't insisting that people had past lives, they were. And he was the one, he said, who just had to follow where the research took him, because he's being a good scientist. And we already know that his researches, quote unquote, had, zero to do with case studies. There was no peer review, and that he was asking very leading questions and driving people where he wanted them to go in their counseling sessions. So it wasn't real research, but this was how Hubbard drummed up support for himself, as he was a philosopher and a researcher.
That's fascinating.
It was through those methods that he claimed to be an authority figure.
That is fascinating because for a couple of reasons. One is, I do have a PhD. I have done science or social science research, and I understand that just understanding how statistics work, most people in the world are never going to be able to fully understand how statistics work. And then from there to become scientifically literate. So it's just a bar that a huge percent of the world is just never going to obtain. So it sounds like he did this sophisticated play that I don't know who else has done this successfully. Instead of just claiming divine authority, which is sort of a shortcut or a cop-out to sort of gaining authority, he's basically relying on the authority of science, but his interpretation of science, which is actually pseudoscience. So he's borrowing on the virtue of science, which is that science is evidence-based and empirically supported, so that everybody who doesn't have the interest or the ability or the intellect or the luxury or the privilege of really understanding science, so that those people that can't really engage scientifically think that they're engaging in something scientific and credible and empirically supported. But in reality, it's just pseudoscience. So he's borrowing on the virtues of science while not being scientific, and then discrediting anything scientifically valid if it doesn't align with his pseudoscience. That's a real mind cluster F, if I can say that.
It is. And that was exactly how he maintained the con for all those decades, because he counted on people's ignorance, their inability to do fact-checking, especially pre-internet. He had no concept that the internet was coming, ever. He claimed to have all this knowledge about past intergalactic civilizations, but he never anticipated the internet. Come on, dude. But he didn't. He didn't anticipate any of that stuff. And he often made these wild-ass claims, but he would make them on the basis that this was stuff that had come up in people's auditing sessions. And the implication was that it had come up in more than one person's auditing session. So therefore, it was being cross-verified right? These information about past civilizations and about past lives and about our spiritual abilities. And all of this was coming from research, from doing auditing and this counseling on people and taking them into these past lives. And if you look at how Hubbard did his auditing, you see that he led them down the garden path, but he was pretty crafty about it. And they thought that they were coming up with their own memories when he was clearly implanting or making suggestions about them. So he was clever. He was canny, and not everybody bought into this. I mean, mind you, there were more people who came in and left Scientology over the years than are still in it. But for the people who would believe it, come in and watch it and be part of it for a while, they would buy into this stuff. And that included my parents. They definitely, my dad went all in on this. And my dad was one of the smartest people I've ever known. He was a smart cookie. But intelligence doesn't have anything to do with it. Like I said, you help somebody and you can convince them of all kinds of things.
Yeah. In the human experience, emotion and pain trumps intellect. And so
That's
many
right.
Mormons, when they leave the Mormon church and no longer believe, they're like, how can intelligent people how can Richard Bushman, how can Terrell Givens, and these are names you won't know, but how can these Mormon scholars still believe in Mormonism? And the whole point is it's not just Trump and lived experience, emotion and lived experience trumps intellect every single time. If you're down and out and miserable, it doesn't matter how smart you are. If you're miserable and you want to die, and if someone can provide you with a life framework that can make you feel happy and healthy and like you're part of something meaningful, that is going to trump intellect 99 times out of 100 for most people. And so, because life can be messy, because it sucks to be alone, because it's hard to figure out what's true, religion is always going to be formed by ingenuous or what's the word?
Disingenuous?
By industrious entrepreneurial types that basically are going to say, I figured out the way to happiness,
right,
and here it is. So that somebody who can't figure it out or who can't find happiness can just hold on to that way as the way because they can't figure it out themselves.
Exactly. That's exactly right. I agree with everything you just said.
Okay, so let's go back to your childhood.
So my effort at critical thinking, the one time I really tried to take a stab at Scientology before I got involved with it, was when I was a teenager and I had started high school, and my friends were kind of ribbing me about my parents doing Scientology. And I was, sort of like, yeah, I don't really get, and they'd heard that, this is 1981, 82. So my parents had, my friends had sort of heard some things about Scientology. Maybe there was a 60 Minutes episode or something like that. And if you recall, at this time, Scientology was in the newspapers and Hubbard's wife was going to jail. I mean, this was a time when Scientology was not experiencing a lot of fun and games. And my parents were still diehard, supporters. They ended up becoming collateral damage in a way of that whole mission fiasco that I sort of talked about when we went through the history of all this stuff. They were working at Pasadena Mission, and they ended up getting kicked off staff and getting declared suppressive for a little while as collateral damage of this whole mission problem. But that sort of happened at a distance from me. I really wasn't aware of what was going on because I was a teenager. I didn't care about anybody else but me, right? So I was not paying a lot of attention to my parents' Scientology life. I still had a roof over my head. I still had a bed to sleep in. I was going to school. I was much more interested in trying to find a girlfriend than I was interested in anything having to do with Scientology. I got some shit about it from my friends at school. I went and confronted my mom one day and I said, hey, what's, you guys pay an awful lot of money into this Scientology stuff and I don't really get it. Why, couldn't we have nicer things? Couldn't we have a nicer life if you guys didn't spend so much money on this? It seems like a crutch, that you guys are using. And that was the most bold criticism I'd ever offered on Scientology as a child, right? I was probably 13 or 14 at this point. And my mom sort of put me in my place. She was like, well, look, we're your parents. We're adults. We get to make decisions. You're still growing up in our house. And so you've never wanted for anything. You've always had food. You've always had clothes. You've always had a bed to sleep in. So it's really not up to you to question how we spend our money. It's our money. And that was it. And I was like, okay, I have now been put in my place, Pretty rational response, really. My mom didn't she was a pretty reasonable person in many ways. So that kind of nipped any kind of criticism of Scientology and their spending habits right in the bud. And I never questioned that again. But the following year, I might have questioned it more, and I might have gone in a whole different direction, except this conversation happened one fine day in the summer between my sophomore and junior years of high school. I was hanging out at home. I had friends. We did role-playing games. We hung out. We went to the mall, that kind of stuff. And my dad said that my dad had started his own company with another Scientologist as a partner, and we had moved up to Santa Maria, California, which is outside of Santa Barbara. And so we were living up there now, and I was going to high school, and my dad said that another person at the company who was looking into Scientology was going to be going to the Santa Barbara church, the org. And would I like to go along to check it out for myself? Would I like to go see what this Scientology stuff is really all about? And since it came from my dad, I didn't really feel like I had the ability to say no. I was a little, whatever of my dad. And again, not because he was ever physically abusive or weird to me. I just kind of had this deference to the things my dad wanted. So I went, I went down to the church. I fully expected, I took books with me. I took a backpack with games and stuff. I fully expected it was going to take me 10 minutes. I was going to blow it off, and that was going to be it. Instead, I went in there and I did the personality test, the Oxford Capacity Analysis, this 200 questions of yes, no, maybe. And I got this graph telling me all about myself. And I had this woman sit down with me and interpret my graph and go over my graph with me. And I've told this story so many times, I'll just kind of cut to the chase and say that she convinced me that I was a shy, introverted 15-year-old, which I was. And so she kind of nailed me on that. And I thought I had been keeping that a pretty closely held, guarded secret, and nobody really knew how shy and introverted I was, when obviously everybody knew. And so she said, we have a class that you can take. It's a communications class. And if you take this class, you will not be shy and introverted anymore, and you will be able to get dates with girls. And I said, sign me up, take my money, shut up and take my money, right? I couldn't sign up fast enough. And of course, let's remember that I went in there with this sort of surface attitude of, I'm going to brush this stuff off. But at the same time, I want to acknowledge that I had been primed for this my whole life. So I didn't really go in there with a neutral attitude about Scientology. I'd had my friends ribbing me and giving me some shit about it, but I also had been raised with this stuff. So I had this idea that Scientology actually did work and actually was true. I just wasn't sure if I wanted to spend my time doing it while I was in high school, when I was more interested in girls and stuff. So it was really a matter of more of priorities with me than it was a matter of I was critical of Scientology or I didn't want to have anything to do with it. So I go in and I get convinced very quickly that I should be doing Scientology. And I then wanted to sign up for classes right away. And I ended up borrowing money from my parents. They would not pay for it themselves. They said, okay, well, if you're going to do it, we'll lend you the money, but you have to pay for it yourself. And I borrowed $900 from them so I could do 3 classes. And $900 to a kid in high school who's working at Burger King, that's a lot of money. But I was really convinced. I mean, it should kind of tell you how convinced I was, right? That this was like the shit. And I wanted it now because I wanted dates with girls, damn it. And I wanted to get along in life better because I didn't like being introverted. I didn't like being the guy who got picked on at school. I didn't like any of that. And this was a possible solution to all of it in one go with a class. I was like, God damn, absolutely, I want to do that. So I started doing classes at the Santa Barbara org, and I went with this guy who would drive me. His name was Doug. And he and I would go down and we worked together on the classes. And I did the communications. I did this very advanced communications class. I didn't do the entry level one. I ended up doing the big one. And then I did a study class where I learned sort of in a codified form all of that study stuff that I'd grown up with, learning to look up words and all the other aspects of Hubbard's ideas about how to study stuff. And I took a class on that basically surveyed the basics of Scientology because I didn't know all those basics. I hadn't read any of the books and stuff yet. I just knew what I had grown up with and what my parents had passed on to me. So I started taking these classes, started going back to school, started looking a little better. But communications-wise, I learned how to look people in the eye, and I learned how to talk to them, and I learned how to listen to what they were saying. But it didn't really help me get any more dates. It didn't really help me overcome all the other cultural and social problems I was having. But I kind of convinced myself that it did, because at least I was able to ask girls out now. They weren't saying yes, but at least I could ask, right? So I considered that a big momentous kind of gain, right? And this is the way that we sell ourselves on these groups, is we're promised the sun, moon, and stars. We don't actually get the sun, moon, and the stars, but we might get something. We might get a little glimmer of sunlight. We might get a little tinkling of a starlight or something, right? You get my analogy. And we buy into that as an acceptable product of our work and our money and our time. And we continue going with it on the promise or the hope that the sun, moon, and stars will eventually manifest themselves. And that's how all these cults work, is they drag you in with these amazing promises, and they do give you something that you think is substantive and is very, very helpful to your life and changed your whole world. Well, the ability to go from not being able to look at girls to being able to ask them out, yeah, that was a good thing. But that was it. That was all I got for $900, right?
Right.
So, but I carried on because, again, I was primed for this. I thought this was like the thing that was going to get me going. And of course, the other thing they tell you in Scientology, and they told me this many times, is that if the current service you did or that you're doing right now isn't handling the problem you're trying to handle, well, the solution's obvious. You just need to do the next service. And the next one, and the next one. And eventually, when you've done all the services, which are going to take you years to do.
And a lot of money.
$1 million when we're talking about Scientology. We're talking about a lot of money. Then you're going to have the sun, moon, and stars, you see. So it's all, the carrot's always dangling out there for you, always. And I, naively bought into it. And I kept doing classes, and I kept going down to the church on a fairly regular basis through the rest of my high school career. And when I was 17 years old, as a senior in high school, I finally graduated. And that summer, I was going to go to college. I was going to be a writer. I wanted to kind of follow in the footsteps of Stephen King, who was kind of one of my literary heroes. I loved his work, and I thought that I could do the same. I was a writer. I'd gotten myself into honors English classes in school. I'd gotten myself promoted into that program by writing stories and showing the teacher I was, literate and creative. I didn't pass the tests, the placement test to get me there, but I earned my way in there anyway. And I loved writing. I loved storytelling. And I thought that's what I was going to do with my life. And instead, I was going down to the church during the summer, and I was doing this purification sauna detox program that they do. And that's a whole another kettle of pseudoscience. But I was doing it. I was sweating out. I was spending 5 hours a day down at the church in Santa Barbara, driving down there every single day to do this detox program. And after I was done each day, they started wrangling me into an office and talking to me about working at the church. Because now that I wasn't going to high school anymore, I could potentially, leave home and start working at the church. And they had a personnel problem they had to solve, and they wanted me to help be the solution for that. And I thought, I don't know that I want to do that. And then they started showing me all these L. Ron Hubbard quotes about saving the world and how Scientology, like they started introducing me to things that they told me were not broad, publicly known by all Scientologists, right? This was hidden information. This was confidential information. They were going to show me things that only staff members could see. The public don't get to see this, but you're special. And we're going to show you this. And they showed me writings from L. Ron Hubbard about how the world was going to, wasn't doing so good. And if Scientology didn't make it, the world wasn't going to make it. And we only had a few years. We were living on borrowed time. The oil crisis and the this crisis and the that crisis. It was all just from people's reactive minds. And we must clear the planet, which means we have to get rid of the reactive minds. We have to get people freed up of all of their stresses and traumas and engrams. And that again, was the reason.
Yeah. Uh-huh. And again, that parallels Mormonism and Christianity's sort of end times focus. We're called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints because of this teaching that the end is near. What humans don't realize is the predictions about the end of existence have been going on for millennia. But a way that an organization loops you in is by making you feel like the end is coming. There's a pending destruction, and you are the chosen person that can help save the planet. And it makes you feel special. It gives you a sense of purpose and meaning and fulfillment. And that's so often how they loop you in. The other thing I just wanted to say, Chris, is that, of course, there's part of me that's thinking, man, it sounds like Scientology is just like self-help turned into a pseudoscience religion. And then I realized that's what you've just been telling us the whole time, that L. Ron Hubbard did Dianetics, which was self-help. And then he realized this could be much more effective without the purview of science and without government regulation. So let's take this self-help pseudoscience stuff, bake it into a religion, and then we'll be super financially and globally successful under those religious protections.
Exactly.
And without science inconveniently telling us that there's no empirical support for what we're actually saying, but it gets a youth like you hooked in, because who doesn't want to be better communicator? Who doesn't want to get rid of their insecurities? Who doesn't want to, get rid of anything that's an inadequacy so that they can be able to find love or find a date or make a family or be happy? And once the religion can convince you that you need them to be able to meet your life goals, then you're hooked.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that was how I got hooked, right? Because it went from the product of them working me over, and it took them days to do it. I was going down there every day. I was kind of a captive audience. I had to go to do this detox program. It was a daily thing. And coming out of the sauna after 5 hours, I was a little tired. And then they start working me over, and they start, doing this recruitment on me to get me to join staff. And there was clear, it was love bombing all over the place, because they kept telling me how great I was, how intelligent I was, how fit I was for working as a staff member, because not everybody is cut out to be a staff member, but you sure are. And I would suck all this stuff up. I mean, it was such an ego fest. I mean, it was awesome for somebody to sit there and, these wonderful people to tell you how wonderful you are, and these are the staff members who have been delivering services to me for the last couple of years. I respect these people. These are authority figures to me. And now they're telling me that I can be one of them, and not only be one of them, but how smart and brilliant I am, and how I'm part of the select few people who can be part of them, right? So I'm buying all of this. I'd never experienced anything like this before, and it felt wonderful. Then they're telling me that I'm going to be part of saving the world, and suddenly Scientology goes from something that I'm doing to improve myself to something that is absolutely necessary for the survival of our species. That was how they recruited me, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so I had personal status going on, and I suddenly had this grim awareness of the world and how the world was going to hell, and I needed to do something about it. This was really, really key, because this put in my head some ideas that I held on to for decades, that made me make decisions that were very, very poor decisions for my life, right? Joining staff was the first one. After joining Scientology, I guess maybe it was the second one. But I went home, and I had to duke it out with my parents a little bit, because they had their own bad experience as Scientology staff members from their mission time. And they had to clear all that up. And I didn't really know a whole lot about it. All I knew is that suddenly they were really mad at me because I wanted to work at the church. They wanted me to do Scientology. They just didn't want me to work at the church, right? They didn't think I knew what I was doing. And you have to sign a 5-year contract of commitment. And the contract didn't promise me a whole lot of anything except free services, right? You get your services in Scientology for free as a staff member. You don't have to pay for them anymore. But they're going to pay you, next to nothing, right? They don't have to pay you anything. You sign up as a religious volunteer. I wasn't so keen. I wasn't so canny enough to be able to read a legal document and understand what I was actually getting into. And my parents tried to warn me, but I was 17 and I was done listening to my parents. So I just needed their signature on the dotted line, because I was a minor still. And they eventually relented, and I joined staff. This is after about 3 days of arguing and haggling back and forth.
And again, your parents didn't want you to join staff. Why?
Because they had been staff, and they saw that
they got screwed over,
abused and treated badly and not paid. And I mean, they saw behind the curtain of staff. They still, like I said, they still thought the subject of Scientology.
Yeah. So and this is powerful. The organization can even mistreat you, but the theology can be so deeply embedded that you remain faithful to the ideology even after the organization has mistreated you.
That's right. And that had been the cycle that my parents had gone through.
Yeah.
And they didn't want to see me make those mistakes. They never, ever wanted me to be on staff, but I got recruited and I was going to save the world. And there is nothing more dangerous to the world at large than a young person who thinks he's saving it. And that was me at 17 years old, right? I was ready to go.
Yeah.
So I joined staff. I moved to Santa Barbara. I moved out of home. And I started, on this journey. And God, there's just a lot of details. And I really don't know. I don't know that we need to get into all the details of 8 years of my life as a staff member. But
does staff mean you're paid? It's a job?
Well, it's supposed to be. And yes, you do get paid. But my paycheck, which was given in cash, by the way, every week, was, maybe $50, $20, $18. A really great week of pay was $75 or $100.
And then how are you paying rent? How are you food?
I had to get another job. At first, my parents were basically supporting me. And for about the first year, they were helping me out. I got it. I was working full-time at the church. I had been sent to LA for training. So I was down there at the big blue buildings. I wasn't Sea Org yet. I was just a staff member. But one of the functions that happens in the Sea Org is they'll get staff from all the churches around and they'll train them on stuff. And I was getting trained to be a classroom supervisor to teach Scientology to other people, and sort of administer the classes. And so I went down to LA to do that. I bombed, because I was kind of, full of myself, and I didn't really understand staff and how staff worked and how the Sea Org worked, and that I was supposed to be subservient. And there was just a bunch of stuff I didn't really understand yet. And so I got sent back to Santa Barbara after 4 months, and I thought I had failed, and they were okay with it. They didn't care. They were like, okay, good. Well, you're back. Let's get you to work and let's get going. And I started working. And after a year, my parents said, look, you got to get a job, man. We can't keep supporting you and supplementing your income and stuff. You really got to take care of yourself. And I agreed. I said, okay, fine. And I was reluctant, but I did it. I tried to leave staff at one point, but they kind of convinced me to stay. And there's a principle in Scientology, especially that is run on staff, hardcore, which is that if you want to leave, it's because of your own sins. It's what they call overts or overt acts, things you do that you wouldn't want somebody to do to you, right? Or things that you do that you know are destructive or harmful in some fashion. Even if that's just slacking off, it can be overt, or it can be, it can be an overt act, or it can be an act of omission, something you don't do that you should do, right? Either one of those can be, a violation of your moral code. And if you violate your own moral code often enough, then you'll want to leave the group because you're trying to protect the group from you, is the theory, right? You're such a bad person. So I'm making all these sacrifices and trying to make this go. And I ended up getting another job. So I'm working 80 hours a week now. 40 of those hours are pretty much unpaid. And the other 40 are just so I can have a job to have a roof over my head, get my own place. I'm struggling, back and forth with this because I'm conflicted, because I still believe I should be able to make money at the church. And the only reason we're not making enough money is because we're not working hard enough and getting the job done. It's not because there's something wrong with Scientology. It's never because there's something wrong with Scientology. It's us, right? We're the ones who aren't fulfilling the potential. So for 8 years, I struggled with this. And I got a job after the first year. I basically maintained outside jobs, but they were always second fiddle, second priority to my Scientology work. That was the stuff that was saving the world. So that's where my focus and attention was on. And then let's see. Lots of ups and downs, lots of, like I said, I tried to leave at one point, and they wrangled me back in. And actually a couple times I took off and tried to, say, look, this isn't for me anymore. But they would always kind of get you back in and, love bomb you and take care of you and treat you well and, and tell you, how needed you were. And
hey, Chris, let me ask you, it was 7 years you were working in that capacity?
8
years. Just without going into detail, what were the main responsibilities you had during those 8 years?
Okay, so first I was responsible for calling people in for the services that they had paid for. Sometimes people would come in, pay for classes, disappear, take off, not do them. So I was working on recovering them. Then I went back to LA the second time, and I succeeded in getting through the training to be a classroom supervisor. And I supervised classes for years. And I did some specialist training for that. Then I rose up. I got promoted to overseeing all of the class work and the counseling work for the church, right, for Santa Barbara. And I was sort of an executive type position, even though I was down, doing classroom supervising and stuff sometimes too. And I sort of oversaw that delivery until 1995. And then that's when I joined the Sea organization.
Okay, so that was your 8 years.
Yep.
Okay, so, and this reminds me of the Landmark Forum a little bit. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but basically,
very much so.
Landmark Forum is an organization that brings people in on weekends and trains you for 2.5 days on, again, life improvement stuff. My sense is it's basically just warmed over secular Buddhism that then has a really almost culty feel to it in terms of how high pressured sales, the event is to try and close other people to attend the Landmark Forum. But one of the most stunning things about Landmark Forum is that they use former participants as volunteers to run the events. So the number of people running any given Landmark Forum event who are paid is actually relatively small, but you become such a believer in the method that you use all these volunteers to help you run the actual seminars. And so it just sounds like people who get recruited into Scientology as employees or as workers do so as volunteers to help promote the basic skills training that Scientology offers. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the staff are all basically volunteers, and we're not really getting paid a whole lot. The
But you're working on helping others go through the coursework, basically.
Oh yeah, but it's more advanced than just helping them. There's special training for all of these jobs.
Yeah.
And so it's not just wrangling people in and saying, hey, can you help him get through his study, or can you sit with him and tutor him a little bit? It's much, much, much more formalized than that. My training took months to get through.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying the training was great. I'm just saying that it took me months to get through it because there's so much to learn about how to teach other people things according to L. Ron Hubbard.
But it's all about the infrastructure for the wealthier members or the members or the engagers who have access to financial resources. All the infrastructure is to help people move people through the
yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Got it.
And the level I was at as a Scientology staff member in Santa Barbara was the lowest, or one of the lower levels of this infrastructure. And there is a hierarchical system. And when I joined the C organization, I was moving up that hierarchy.
And again, the hierarchy is it called the bridge? What's it called?
No, that's the organization structure is just the organization. The bridge to total freedom is the services that are also hierarchically arranged. Everybody does this service, and then everybody does this one, and then everybody does this one. It's a set series of services. There might be some individual variations in what you do with a person at one level or another, but they move up these levels of spiritual awareness and ability, and that is the bridge to total freedom. The organizational structure is how that bridge is delivered.
And are there explicit levels in the organization, like actual levels?
There are, and the levels involve basically, there's only really two of them. There's staff, and then there's Sea Org.
Okay.
And the staff deliver a certain block of services up to a certain level, and beyond that level, you need Sea Org members, and Sea Org members deliver the rest of the bridge.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, that's how it breaks down.
Okay.
And so as a staff member, we were only responsible for people up to the level of clear on the grade chart or the bridge. So we could deliver all of those services. All of that stuff is not confidential. Anybody can go in, look at that stuff, read it. Look, there's nothing advanced about it. It's not the Xenu stuff. That stuff is done by the Sea Org.